Imagine a world where death came knocking at every door, sweeping villages empty in weeks, leaving fear, grief, and mystery behind. This is the story of the Black Death, the plague that changed Europe forever. Discover the hidden tales of survival, courage, and horror that history almost forgot. Watch till the end. Under the fading light of a spring evening in the year 1347, the streets of Messina in Sicily carried the smell of the sea, of drying fish nets left on the shore, and of bread just pulled from the ovens of small bakeries that crouched along the harbour. The town was alive in its ordinary rhythm, with merchants calling out prices, children chasing each other through the dusty alleys, and sailors singing in rough voices as they unloaded crates from the ships that had arrived from the east. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones mixed with the distant ringing of church bells that signalled vespers. It was a world that seemed solid and enduring, a place where generations had lived by the same rhythms of trade and prayer, feast and famine, love and loss. Yet that evening, as the sun painted the water crimson and the air grew cool, a strange heaviness pressed down upon the town, though few could name it. Among the ships that anchored that week was one unlike the others, a Genoese vessel that carried not only silk and spices, but also something far darker, unseen, clinging to the shadows of the cargo hold. On its deck, sailors coughed behind their hands, their faces pale, their eyes glassy with fever. Some lay curled against the wooden rails, too weak to rise, while others muttered prayers that slipped away into the salt air. Rats skittered across the ropes, their black eyes gleaming as they disappeared into the alleys of the town. To the ordinary eye, nothing seemed extraordinary. Ships often brought sickness, men fell ill, and life went on. But whispers began to ripple, small at first. A merchant's son who died suddenly, his skin marked by dark swellings, a fishwife who collapsed at her stall, her breath gone before a prayer could be uttered. The priest who buried them spoke words of comfort, yet in his own chest a seed of fear had begun to sprout. For the people of Messina, life was woven from both light and shadow, and they had always known hardship. Yet there was something unsettling in the swiftness of this illness, in the way it leapt from body to body as though carried on the very wind. Each cough in the marketplace drew uneasy glances, each faint cry at night seemed sharper. Families barred their doors earlier, windows shuttered before darkness fell. Still children played, bread was baked, and the sea smelled of salt as always. The balance of ordinary life remained, yet just slightly askew, like a picture frame tilted on the wall. In a small house near the harbour, a weaver named Matteo sat by the fire, his hands roughened from years of work, his mind uneasy. His wife, Lucia, hummed softly as she spun flax, and their daughter, Caterina, played with scraps of cloth on the floor, arranging them as if they were pieces of a puzzle. Matteo had heard the rumours from the docks, of sailors who bled from their mouths, of bodies thrown into the sea before they reached shore. He told himself such things were tales, exaggerated as sailors' stories often were. Yet the sound of coughing seemed to follow him, from the marketplace to the church to the very air he breathed. The smell of garlic and stew filled the room, comforting in its simplicity, but beneath it lingered the faint sourness of fear. At the tavern that night, men gathered as always, mugs of wine in hand, the air thick with smoke and laughter. Yet their words betrayed them, talk of an eastern curse, of God's wrath, of pestilence riding the ships. Some swore it was punishment for greed, others for sin, still others muttered about poisoned wells or evil spirits. The laughter came too loud, too forced, as if to drown out the truth none wished to name. On the altar of the town church, candles burned low, their wax pooling like slow tears. Father Johnny, the parish priest, prayed longer than usual, his knees aching on the cold stone, his voice hushed as though he feared the walls might overhear him. He prayed for protection, for mercy, for understanding, but his heart whispered a question he dared not speak aloud. What if the world itself was changing? What if this sickness was not a passing shadow but the dawn of something vast? Outside, the wind carried the smell of the sea, yet also a faint odour sharper, more bitter, the scent of illness, though few could yet name it. Dogs barked without reason, cats prowled the alleys, and the town seemed to hold its breath. As days passed, the sickness spread. The first funerals were quiet, hurried affairs, the bodies wrapped and lowered into the ground with little ceremony. Families mourned quickly, afraid to linger. The graveyard filled faster than the priest could recite his words. Women clutched amulets against their breasts. Men drew signs of the cross more often than before, and children watched with wide, questioning eyes. And still the ships came, bringing goods and news, but also more whispers, more tales of cities to the east where streets lay silent, where carts carried the dead to pits, where no prayers seemed to help. Matteo's neighbor, a shoemaker named Pietro, spoke of Constantinople, of a plague so fierce that entire quarters of the city lay abandoned. Others scoffed, saying it was only rumor, meant to frighten. But the shoemaker's eyes were hollow, his voice low, as if the memory itself clung to him like a shadow. Food still cooked, bread still baked, songs still rose from the taverns, yet the fabric of life frayed at its edges. It was in the silence of night that the change was felt most deeply, the absence of laughter in the streets, the hurried steps, the cries muffled behind shuttered windows. Even the sea, eternal and vast, seemed darker, its waves heavier, as though it too bore witness. One evening, as Lucia prepared a stew of lentils and onions, Matteo noticed the faint swellings on the neck of his neighbor's wife, bluish-black beneath the skin, like bruises from an unseen hand. She coughed weakly, her eyes sunken, her movements slow. By morning she was gone, her husband's wails echoing through the alley. The disease had a face now, a presence that no prayer could deny. Panic began to stir. Some families fled inland, carrying what they could on carts or backs, seeking refuge in villages, hoping distance would shield them. Others locked themselves inside their homes, boards nailed across doors, believing isolation would save them. Merchants hesitated to open their shops, sailors refused to touch ropes without gloves, priests sprinkled more holy water than ever before. The marketplace grew quieter, the laughter in taverns dimmed, the church bells tolled more often, each ring heavy as stone. Matteo lay awake at night, listening to his daughter's breathing, to the crackle of the dying fire, to the silence beyond the walls. He thought of the loom, of the threads he had woven for years, of how fragile they were, how easily they snapped. Was life any different? The illness crept unseen, weaving itself into the fabric of their days, stronger than any hand could resist. And yet, amid the fear, life persisted. Children still laughed in bursts, lovers still met in shadowed corners, bread still baked, candles still burned. The human heart clung to hope, to habit, to the belief that tomorrow might be kinder. But the shadow lengthened, and whispers grew into cries. One morning, as the sun rose pale over the harbour, a cart rattled through the streets, its wheels creaking under the weight of bodies covered with rough cloth. People turned their faces away, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. The air smelled of salt and death, of smoke from hurried fires, of garlic and vinegar used to ward off sickness. The town of Messina, once alive with trade and laughter, now stood at the threshold of something vast, something none could name but all could feel. The story of the plague had arrived, carried not only by rats and fleas, but by fear, by rumour, by the trembling of human hearts. And in the house near the harbour, Matteo held his daughter close, listening to the bells toll once more, knowing that life had shifted, that something immense had begun, though its full shape lay hidden beyond the horizon of days yet to come. That night, under a sky scattered with stars, the sea whispered against the stones, and the people of Messina dreamed uneasy dreams, unaware that their small corner of the world was only the beginning, that across Europe the same shadow was already spreading, already waiting to be named. And so the first part of the tale rests there, with a city trembling between the comfort of habit and the edge of terror, poised on the threshold of a darkness that would stretch across continents. What began in whispers by the harbour would soon roar across kingdoms, leaving no life untouched, no soul untested. The loom of history had caught a new thread, and its weaving had only just begun. The shadow spread beyond Messina like ink spilled across parchment, carried by caravans, sailors, pilgrims, and merchants who never imagined that their footsteps bore death as surely as their goods bore profit. And in every town along the routes of trade the same pattern appeared: first whispers of illness, then sudden collapse of ordinary life. The market stalls abandoned, the bells tolling endlessly, the smell of incense battling the stench of decay, and stories followed the sickness like companions. Some said it came from the east as punishment, others that it rose from poisoned air or mists from swamps, while scholars argued and priests prayed ordinary families faced hunger and terror, and the slow unravelling of their days. In Florence great houses that once overflowed with laughter stood silent, curtains drawn against the world. In Paris the Seine carried more than fish, it bore the refuse of the dying washed from crowded streets. And in London shutters closed as quickly as they opened, for fear that the breath of a neighbour could be enough to invite doom. Yet even as it devoured cities the plague revealed strange details. People noted how the swellings appeared like dark roses blooming upon the skin, some filled with pus, others hardened and cold, and when they burst they left behind the smell of rot that clung to clothes and walls so strongly that vinegar and smoke could barely mask it. Physicians tried remedies, leeches, herbs, powders of crushed emeralds, ground pearls, even charms against evil spirits, yet the pestilence mocked them all, for it obeyed no rule, no prayer, no price. And so grave diggers became busier than bakers, while children learned silence far earlier than play. And yet the world did not stop. For all its horror, the plague did not only destroy, it transformed the rhythm of life. Peasants who survived sometimes found themselves masters of abandoned fields. Wages rose in some places as labor grew scarce, and the rigid order of society trembled under the weight of so much death. Music too changed. Songs grew darker, more plaintive, filled with the memory of empty chairs at feasts and vacant places in church choirs. Still the human heart clung stubbornly to meaning. Mothers told children tales of angels guarding the doors, fathers carved charms into wood or scratched prayers onto walls, and in the deep of night, as stars burned cold above the survivors, asked the oldest question of all: why here, why now, why us? And in the silence that followed only the wind carried an answer, for the plague was not merely sickness, but mirror. It showed the fragility of kingdoms and kitchens alike. It reminded princes and beggars that death paid no heed to crowns or coins, and yet in its terrible wake it left seeds of change, small, fragile, but real, as villages rebuilt with new customs, as healers observed patterns that would one day shape the birth of medicine, as memory itself became a teacher whispering that no age is safe from shadow, even as dawn returns. And so across Europe, from Sicily to the Baltic, the story of the plague grew not only as a tale of death, but as one of survival, of how the human spirit bent, but did not break, and how the echo of that time lingers still in songs, in customs, in quiet fears, and in the simple act of washing hands with care. For though centuries pass, the memory of the great pestilence remains like a faint scar upon the heart of the world, waiting to be remembered, waiting to remind. And in that memory we stand still, listening to bells that once tolled without end. In the third turn of the tale, the plague no longer felt like a storm passing through, but like a new season that clung to the earth, shaping every habit, every breath. Entire families vanished in a week, leaving houses sealed with marks of chalk, or smeared crosses painted by trembling priests to warn others away, and the silence of deserted homes became as terrifying as the cries of the dying travelers told of towns where grass grew in the market squares because no one came to trade, and of monasteries where rows of monks lay still, their chants silenced forever, while in the countryside some villagers chose to wall themselves off from the world, closing gates, refusing strangers, believing isolation would shield them. And sometimes it worked for a season, yet often one cough slipped through, and the gates that once kept death away only locked it inside. People began to notice strange details: the rats that scurried along beams, the fleas that bit in the night, the way illness seemed to follow not only the sick but also the fabric of wool and fur carried along trade routes. Still physicians argued whether it was air, water, stars, or sin, and so the poor wore garlands of herbs or pressed cloths soaked in vinegar against their faces, hoping to cleanse the invisible poison, while the wealthy fled to country estates carrying musician servants, and hope with them. Yet even in those green fields the plague followed, as if distance were nothing, for the sickness rode in carts, hid in clothes, clung to breath itself. One curious detail remembered in chronicles is how some doctors wore the beaked masks filled with rosemary, lavender, or camphor, believing sweet scents might block corruption. Those figures with long cloaks and glass eyes became symbols of dread, for when one entered a street it meant death had already arrived. And yet within the darkness stories of resilience also lived. People married quickly, fearing they had little time. Lovers wrote letters as if every word might be the last. Children Played amid ruins, their laughter sharp against the silence. Merchants devised safer ways to handle coins, dipping them in vinegar, or leaving them beneath stones for days before touching them, and in the minds of many a new idea quietly grew. Perhaps sickness was not only punishment, perhaps it had causes hidden in the natural world that could one day be understood. Written accounts from Italian city-states note how survivors began to keep records of who fell ill when and where, unknowingly laying stones for future study of disease, even as they wept for their families at night. And so the plague carved a paradox. It destroyed, but also forced people to observe, to adapt, to imagine that knowledge itself might be a kind of protection. And though few in that age could see it, the memory of these terrible years would one day push Europe toward new paths of medicine, new balances of power, and new ways of life, for in the ashes of fear change takes root, slowly, quietly, until one day it flowers. And as the bells tolled through every valley, a question remained: how long could the world endure this shadow, and what would be left when it finally lifted? By the fourth chapter of the great pestilence, the world seemed caught between despair and strange renewal, for though death still roamed the streets in its silent cloak, people began to weave new forms of life around the shadow. Monasteries, once filled with monks, became empty shells, their gardens overgrown. Yet in some places villagers reclaimed the land, planting barley and beans where chants had once echoed, and in towns survivors gathered in smaller circles, sharing bread by firelight, telling tales of those lost. And those who endured the plague had taken so much, yet it also loosened the iron grip of old orders. Serfs, who once bent beneath their lords, found fields abandoned, and claimed them for their own. Wages rose in certain places, because labor was scarce, and voices that had been silent began to speak with new weight. Still the memory of horror lingered in every gesture. Families who survived ate differently, believing certain foods might guard them: garlic, onions, strong wine, boiled herbs, and strange mixtures like vinegar steeped with sage became part of daily life. Amulets carved from bone or stone dangled from necks. Bells were rung in doorways to chase away evil spirits, and whole processions wound through cities carrying relics under banners, singing hymns until voices cracked with exhaustion. Yet even these rituals sometimes spread more sickness than hope, for crowds carried death as surely as faith. Chroniclers of the age noted curious details: how cats and dogs were slaughtered in some towns because people feared they carried the pest, though the true culprits, the fleas on black rats, thrived unseen in barns and kitchens. In other places flagellants wandered the roads, men whipping their own backs with iron-tipped cords, believing that suffering would cleanse the world of sin. And wherever they passed people gathered to watch, some weeping, some joining their cries, rising into the night like storms of sorrow and zeal. Yet the plague did not fade at their command. It rose and fell in waves, vanishing for months, only to return with equal fury, until trust in old certainties grew thin and hearts turned inward, asking whether survival depended less on rituals than on caution and care. One interesting legacy of these years was in art and music. Images of death appeared everywhere: skeletons dancing with peasants and kings alike, painted on church walls, carved into wood, and sung in verses that spread from town to town. The dance of death, as it was called, reminded all that mortality bound them together, and though grim it carried also a strange equality, for the scythe did not pause for crowns or gold. Another curious echo was in language itself, for words of sickness and mourning entered proverbs and sayings still spoken centuries later, shaping how communities remembered loss. Yet amid all this people still sought joy. Survivors celebrated festivals more fiercely once the sickness ebbed, dancing in squares, feasting on whatever harvest could be found, drinking until dawn, as if to prove that life itself defied the shadow. And in the quiet after such nights one could sense both grief and gratitude braided together like threads on a loom. The plague had carved scars, but also planted seeds of change that would outlast the century. And as travelers carried news of its decline in one region and rise in another, the question whispered in every hearth remained: would the shadow ever truly end, or would it walk beside humanity forever, unseen but never gone? By the fifth chapter of this long night, the plague had become more than a shadow. It was a presence that lived in every corner of Europe, shaping thought, habit, faith, and fear alike. And wherever one walked, the marks of its hand were written upon the earth. In towns where once bells rang only for feast days, now their iron voices told so often that silence itself felt like a stranger. And in villages where neighbors had once gathered to share bread and wine, the hearths grew cold, and the benches empty. Fields lay until houses stood abandoned, their shutters banging in the wind. And yet within that desolation people continued to breathe, to endure, to seek fragments of meaning in a world reshaped by loss. In Florence, the great city of merchants and painters, the plague struck with a fury so swift that within weeks entire quarters lay silent. Chroniclers wrote of carts rumbling through narrow streets filled with bodies piled so high that the living turned their eyes away and fled to the Countryside Boccaccio himself in his Decameron described how 10 young Florentines left the stricken city to tell stories in a villa beyond its walls, seeking to preserve not only life, but the art of laughter and love in the face of death. And through those tales we still hear today the echo of a moment when human voices refused to be silenced even as their city collapsed around them in Avignon, where the Pope himself resided the plague forced the Church into frantic action. Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into its waters when the cemeteries overflowed, and he sat day after day surrounded by fires believing that the flames would cleanse the poisoned air that carried the disease. Yet even there, with prayers chanted night and day, the pestilence spared neither priest nor cardinal, and faith itself trembled under the weight of unanswered pleas. In England the pestilence came first to the ports, then to London and beyond, and chroniclers describe how grass grew in the streets of villages once filled with laughter, how sheep wandered without shepherds, how whole manors fell into ruin, because no tenant remained to work the land. Yet in that devastation, a strange transformation occurred. Laborers, who survived, found themselves suddenly in demand. Wages rose, laws were passed to hold them down, yet the shift had begun. The rigid feudal order cracked beneath the weight of empty fields and silent barns, and though many did not see it at the time, this change would ripple forward, shaping the rise of new freedom centuries later. And in every land curious details were remembered, small fragments that paint the human scale of the disaster. Physicians carried long rods to touch their patients, so as not to breathe the same air, and those with means built small gardens where they could walk in circles hoping fresh air might shield them. Families hung herbs over doors, rosemary, thyme, sage, cloves, and juniper were burned in homes, the smoke stinging eyes but believed to drive out poison. Some carried small balls of ambergris or perfumed pomanders, holding them close to their noses in crowded streets. And when hope faltered, people turned to stranger remedies, drinking mixtures of crushed emeralds, ground pearls, or mercury potions that killed as surely as the sickness itself, while others believed laughter was medicine, and sought plays, music, and merriment whenever they could find them, as if joy itself might shield the soul from despair. Yet not all responses were so innocent. The plague bred suspicion and fear, and in many cities scapegoats were sought. Whispers rose that wells had been poisoned, that outsiders brought the pest, and Jewish communities across Europe suffered massacres, as desperate people sought someone to blame. Whole quarters burned, their residents slaughtered, though the true enemy was too small to see and too deeply woven into daily life for blame to touch it. Chroniclers record that in Strasbourg, on a single day in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the public square, while others who could fled eastward toward Poland, where rulers at times offered protection. And so the plague shaped not only bodies, but the course of nations, scattering peoples, breaking bonds, and forging new ones in unexpected places. Yet amid the horror, communities also found ways to hold together. In England children skipped to rhymes that spoke of roses and ashes, words that centuries later would be remembered as a faint echo of this dark time. In Germany folk songs told of the danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons led men and women of every rank in a circle, reminding all that fate was shared. In France artists painted the triumph of death on church walls, filling them with images of bones and coffins, so that worshippers would see with their eyes what they already felt in their hearts. And strangely these grim images brought comfort, for they told people they were not alone, that all stood together in their shadow of mortality. And in kitchens across Europe daily life continued with small acts of resilience. Bread, still baked though often with poorer grain for harvests, had faltered. Stews of onions, garlic, beans, and herbs simmered over fires, and vinegar was added to nearly everything, for people believed it chased away corruption. Children still played, though their games often carried darker tones, imitating funerals or pretending to ward off sickness, with charms, and laughter, though thin, still rang like a fragile shield against despair. The pestilence also brought new forms of solitude. Hermits withdrew into forests, believing that silence and distance offered safety. Scholars shut themselves with books and parchment, recording each rumor, each detail of symptoms, hoping that knowledge might offer a path through the darkness. One such man in Paris noted carefully how swellings first appeared in the groin or under the arm, how fever rose, how within 3 days death often followed his records, though born of sorrow, planted seeds that centuries later would help others understand contagion and pattern. And so amid death, a kind of science quietly stirred. Yet perhaps the most striking legacy of this chapter was how the plague reminded people of equality. The mighty and the lowly fell alike, kings and peasants, merchants and beggars, all carried the same dark roses upon their skin. In London the archbishop himself perished, while in small villages shepherds lay forgotten on their hillsides, their flocks wandering without care. And in that brutal equality people found both terror and strange solace, for in death all were brothers, and in survival too, And so when the pestilence waned, as it sometimes did, vanishing like mist after rain, survivors came together to feast, to sing, to rebuild. Whole villages held festivals with wild dancing and wine flowing freely, because life itself felt like a victory feast. Tables groaned with whatever food could be gathered: roast fowl, loaves of dark bread, cheese, apples, and jugs of ale, and for a night or two the shadow seemed to lift, replaced by the glow of firelight and the hum of human voices. Yet always in the distance the bell tolled again, reminding all that the reprieve was only a pause, that the wave would rise again. And in this knowledge the human spirit learned resilience, to live fully even while death walked close by. And perhaps that is the most curious truth of this part of the tale, that the plague, which seemed only to destroy, also taught endurance, adaptability, and the fierce beauty of survival. For in the face of endless loss, people still planted crops, still told stories, still carved images into stone, still sang into the night. And though the dance of death claimed many, it also left behind a deeper awareness of life itself that lingered in the generations to come. And as the chronicles close on this stage of the great pestilence, we stand with those who survived, listening to the faint music of their feasts, the crackle of their fires, the whisper of their prayers, knowing that their world had been remade, and ours too still carries the echo. For the scars of that age live not only in books and ruins, but in customs, words, songs, and the quiet knowledge that life is fragile yet enduring. And as night falls once more, we leave the survivors standing on the threshold of yet another wave, their faces lit by firelight, their eyes both weary and unyielding, their hands clutching bread and wine as if in defiance, and their voices murmuring not of death, but of the hope that tomorrow, though uncertain, still belongs to the living. The plague lingered across years like a shadow that refused to lift, returning in waves that defied hope. And though the great pestilence of the 14th century had already torn through towns and villages with unimaginable cruelty, survivors soon realized that what they had thought was an ending was only a pause, for new outbreaks would flare again and again, in smaller but still devastating bursts, shaping an entire generation's sense of fragility. And as I continue this tale, it is important to recall that life never simply resumed as it had been before, for the plague altered everything, from the rhythms of harvest to the trust in neighbors, from the language of prayer to the measures of law, because once you lived through streets emptied by sudden death, you could never fully believe in stability again, and this fear carved deep grooves in culture, so that ballads sung by shepherds told of vanished companions, chronicles written by monks noted omens in the stars, and even architecture bore traces of the fear, for charnel houses were expanded, and stone reliefs of skeletons dancing with the living appeared on church walls, grim reminders that death walked beside every man, woman, and child. In cities where the plague struck hardest, the very structure of government was shaken, for council members fled or died, leaving power vacuums filled sometimes by desperate merchants or harsh military stewards. And in the countryside, peasants who survived found that labor was scarce, so wages rose in ways that alarmed nobles, prompting uprisings and harsh crackdowns, meaning that the plague not only destroyed lives but also transformed economies, laws, and social orders. And this transformation, though born in misery, reshaped Europe forever. Yet beyond politics and money there was the intimate daily struggle with fear, for people carried charms, painted crosses on their doors, burned foul-smelling herbs, believing that corrupted air spread the sickness, while others turned to astrology, blaming conjunctions of planets, and still others whispered of poisoned wells or divine wrath. And the search for answers often turned neighbor against neighbor, with foreigners, Jews, lepers, or simply the poor accused of causing the pestilence, leading to persecutions that compounded tragedy with cruelty, so that the plague was both disease and a spark for human violence. What is striking is that even amid despair, creativity flourished in strange ways, for writers, painters, and poets sought to capture the horror, sometimes as warning, sometimes as release. And so we find tales like Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Florence, where a group of young people flee the city to tell stories in safety, reflecting both the escapism and the moral reflection that the plague inspired. And similar accounts appear in less famous chronicles, each trying to make sense of the senseless, each blending memory and imagination to preserve the lessons of suffering. Physicians of the time, lacking real understanding of bacteria or fleas, nonetheless tried to systematize their observations, recording symptoms such as swelling buboes, sudden fevers, black spots beneath the skin, and the stench of decay even before death, and they debated treatments from bloodletting to concoctions of herbs, vinegar, and even crushed emeralds for those wealthy enough to attempt such remedies. Yet mortality remained staggering, reminding them that their art was feeble before the power of the unseen. And so people turned to faith, pilgrimages, processions, self-flagellation, desperate to appease an angry god. Yet these gatherings sometimes spread the plague further, creating a tragic irony, and priests themselves often died in droves, leaving parishes leaderless, so that lay people improvised prayers and rituals, reshaping spiritual life at the grassroots. In the East, too, the plague carved deep scars, spreading along trade routes into the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, carried by caravans and ships, proving that no wall or border could fully contain it. And though different cultures interpreted its cause in different ways, from divine punishment to corrupted air or unseen spirits, everywhere it left the same imprint of grief, abandonment, and transformation. What is equally fascinating is that the plague did not vanish entirely even after the so-called Black Death subsided, for it returned periodically, striking Marseille in the 1720s, ravaging London in the 1660s, and haunting Istanbul, Cairo, and many other cities over centuries, reminding humanity again and again of vulnerability, until modern science, with its understanding of Yersinia pestis and the role of rats and fleas, finally gave tools to fight back, though even today isolated outbreaks sometimes emerge, proof that history is never fully past. Looking back, one sees how the plague was not only a biological event but also a mirror, reflecting human fears, faiths, and failings, forcing communities to decide whether to turn inward with suspicion or outward with compassion. And though too often suspicion won, there were also countless moments of courage. Nuns tending the sick though they knew death would follow, gravediggers who worked tirelessly though shunned by all, mothers who stayed beside fevered children until their own last breath. And these quiet acts of love remind us that even in eras defined by darkness, humanity's light was not extinguished. Today, when we read these accounts or walk through old cemeteries where mass graves lie beneath the grass, we can still feel the echo of that time, when every cough was feared, every dawn brought uncertainty, and every life was balanced on a knife's edge. And in that echo lies the lesson that fragility and resilience are twin threads in the human story, and that the plague, as terrible as it was, shaped the course of history by forcing new paths of thought, faith, and society. As the years passed and the shadow of the plague stretched across towns and countrysides, it became clear that its impact extended far beyond the immediate toll of death, for it reshaped the very fabric of human experience, altering customs, work, belief, and imagination in ways both subtle and profound, and everywhere that the pestilence passed, it left a dual legacy of fear and resilience, a paradox of destruction and creativity intertwined. And in cities that had once teemed with life, the streets became quiet classrooms of survival, for people observed, adapted, and recorded the signs of the disease, sometimes meticulously, sometimes in folklore and song, creating a cultural memory that would endure for centuries. In Florence, for example, artists painted the dance of death, skeletons leading the living in solemn procession, a stark reminder of mortality. Yet these images also allowed communities to confront their fear, to ritualize grief, and to find a form of collective endurance. And in the workshops and studios, artisans adapted to the new realities, producing candles, painted crosses, charms, and herbal remedies, small industries born of necessity that transformed the way people related to illness and the unknown. In England, chronicles describe how villages that survived organized themselves differently, with laborers in greater demand, wages rising, and social hierarchies subtly shifting as the scarcity of hands forced lords to negotiate more fairly. And in that quiet upheaval lay the seeds of change, of gradual social mobility that would ripple through generations, while daily life adapted in countless small ways. Women cooking soups with garlic, onions, and strong herbs, believing these flavors to ward off sickness, children carrying tiny amulets, families avoiding crowded streets, sprinkling vinegar around doorways, and improvising quarantine practices long before the word existed. And though many of these practices were rooted in superstition, they reflect an astonishing human impulse to act, to try, to create order out of chaos, to assert control when so much seemed uncontrollable. Across Europe, the intellectual response evolved too, for scholars, physicians, and clergy began recording patterns, noting the progression of buboes, fevers, and sudden death, attempting to understand causes even in the absence of germ theory, with physicians like Guy de Chauliac in France treating patients with a mix of diet, bloodletting, and herbal concoctions while carefully documenting what succeeded and what failed, laying groundwork for later medical knowledge, and the fear of contagion led to innovations in public health, such as quarantines, cordon districts, and isolation of the sick, practices that were crude but showed a growing recognition that human behavior could influence the spread of disease. Yet alongside these organized efforts, fear and superstition often produced darker outcomes, as strangers, minorities, and marginalized groups were scapegoated, sometimes violently, and massacres occurred in cities like Strasbourg and Toulon, reflecting how terror could erode moral restraint, and in some cases, entire Jewish communities were forced to flee eastward, reshaping the demographic and cultural map of Europe. In homes, daily life was infused with tension and vigilance. Bread baking was accompanied by constant monitoring of family members for signs of swelling or fever. Meals often consisted of gruel, beans, and preserved meats, and candles burned through the night not only for light but as talismans against the unseen, while parents whispered prayers over children, recounting stories of saints and angels as protective figures, blending practical caution with spiritual comfort. And in these quiet rituals, the resilience of human culture became most evident, for even amid grief, people sought to preserve memory, teach survival, and instill hope. The plague also altered the perception of death itself, for mass graves, charnel pits, and overcrowded cemeteries forced communities to confront mortality directly, and funerary practices shifted. Coffins were sometimes shared, bodies wrapped hastily, priests reciting prayers under pressure, while the living learned to cope with repeated exposure to loss, to continue farming, trading, and maintaining social bonds despite the omnipresence of death. And in this crucible, social cohesion was both tested and forged, as neighbors, guilds, and religious fraternities banded together to care for the sick, bury the dead, and maintain the basic functions of towns. Remarkably, the arts and literature of the period flourished even under such strain, as writers like Petrarch observed the fragility of human life and recorded reflections on mortality, while painters and sculptors found new expression in macabre imagery, emphasizing transience, the beauty of fleeting life, and the inevitability of death, turning horror into contemplation and caution into aesthetic form, so that fear itself became a lens through which culture was refracted. Commerce and trade were likewise transformed, for ports and markets adapted to the threat of contagion, with some cities implementing rudimentary quarantines, others redesigning street layouts to prevent crowding, and merchants learning that the movement of goods could carry unseen hazards, while simultaneously, the scarcity of labor allowed common workers greater bargaining power, contributing to subtle shifts in feudal hierarchies and economic structures that would resonate long after the plague receded. At the level of family and community, the plague taught profound lessons in observation, hygiene, and precaution, as people experimented with ventilation, cleansing, isolation, and herbal remedies, while maintaining rituals of care and devotion. And these practices, though imperfect and often grounded in misunderstanding, reflect an enduring human capacity for adaptation and intelligence even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, a capacity that would inform public health centuries later. And yet despite the bleakness, there were moments of human joy and tenderness, as festivals cautiously resumed when waves subsided, as music and storytelling revived spirits, as lovers courted with a heightened intensity born from the awareness of mortality, and as children played, albeit with rituals and games shadowed by the lessons of death, a paradoxical celebration of life. Amid the omnipresence of loss, showing that even when societies are battered by catastrophe, the human impulse to nurture, create, and connect remains resilient. The plague also left an enduring mark on memory and narrative, as chroniclers, poets, and artists wove accounts of suffering into stories designed to preserve knowledge, instill moral reflection, and transmit the lived experience to future generations, producing a collective archive of grief and survival that shaped European consciousness, informing later medical practice, urban planning, and cultural expression. In essence, the plague was not only a biological phenomenon but a profound teacher of human adaptability, social dynamics, mortality, and culture, a force that destroyed and yet inspired, decimated populations yet spurred reflection, community, and innovation, and as survivors rebuilt, they carried forward not only scars but wisdom, rituals, and practices that would inform generations, from public health to art to social organization, illustrating the inseparable connection between catastrophe and human resilience. And when we walk through European towns, examine their architecture, read medieval chronicles, or study artworks filled with skeletons and funerary symbolism, we see the lasting imprint of the plague on human consciousness, a reminder of fragility, mortality, and the capacity for endurance, a story of how societies confront devastation, adapt, and find continuity amid loss. And in the echoes of those centuries-long shadows, we understand that the Black Death shaped not only the bodies it claimed but the minds, hearts, and cultures that endured, leaving a heritage of memory, caution, creativity, and resilience that continues to ripple through time, teaching us that even in the darkest epochs, life finds ways to persist, adapt, and transform, and that humanity's response to catastrophe is as much a part of history as the event itself. And so, as the 7th chapter closes, we stand among those survivors who faced death at every turn, listening to the distant toll of bells, smelling the smoke of fires, tasting the bitter herbs that once warded off unseen enemies, feeling both fear and courage, and knowing that the world has been changed forever by the passage of the shadow, yet that human life, stubborn and creative, endures, carrying with it lessons in survival, compassion, and remembrance that whisper through every street, every field, and every heart. As the centuries unfolded and the last echoes of the great pestilence receded into memory, the world that emerged was forever changed by the shadow that had walked so relentlessly through cities, villages, and countryside alike. For even as the bodies returned to the soil and markets gradually filled with voices and footsteps, the lessons of the plague persisted in every aspect of life, in law, commerce, medicine, faith, and culture, and everywhere one looked, the imprint of those dark years could be traced, subtle yet unmistakable, shaping not only survival but the very way people understood mortality, risk, and human connection. And in this final chapter, it is fitting to observe how the lived experience of death, fear, and resilience left a legacy that resonates even today, a faint but persistent whisper carried through streets, songs, architecture, rituals, and collective memory, a heritage of endurance encoded in human practice. In towns that had once been decimated by sudden waves of illness, civic authorities began to implement more systematic public health measures, rudimentary though they were. Quarantines at city gates, cordoned-off neighborhoods, and ordinances regarding the handling of corpses reflected a new awareness that disease followed human movement, trade, and contact, and though the science of bacteria and fleas was unknown, these early efforts illustrate a capacity for observation, adaptation, and collective protection, and in those measures, one can see the roots of modern epidemiology, for careful records of deaths, symptoms, and timing, painstakingly maintained by local officials, physicians, and chroniclers, became invaluable repositories of knowledge, later informing more systematic approaches to outbreaks, while in private households, habits refined during repeated waves endured, cleansing with vinegar and smoke, isolation of the sick, careful attention to ventilation, and the use of aromatic herbs to mask odors were all practices that persisted long after the immediate threat, quietly influencing domestic culture and hygiene for generations. Beyond pragmatic adaptations, the psychological and social consequences of the plague proved profound, for the collective trauma reshaped human relationships and perceptions of mortality. Families who survived often faced loss on a scale unimaginable today, yet the bonds among survivors strengthened as grief was shared and remembered, and communities evolved social norms that reflected both fear and compassion, balancing caution with cooperation, suspicion with solidarity, while memorials, artworks, and literature transformed suffering into cultural expression, ensuring that the horrors would not fade silently but would remain active in consciousness, teaching humility, reflection, and resilience. Artists and writers across Europe channeled the profound awareness of death into enduring cultural forms, producing iconography and narratives that carried moral, spiritual, and practical lessons. From the macabre skeletal figures of the Danse Macabre to illuminated manuscripts depicting the sick and dying in tender, humanizing detail, to chronicles recounting both the calamity and acts of courage, Every artifact served as a testament to the interplay of mortality and human creativity, showing that even under relentless devastation, the impulse to record, to narrate, to communicate endured. In medicine, the plague catalyzed early empirical observation, as physicians like Guy de Chauliac, John of Burgundy, and others meticulously documented symptoms, outcomes, and environmental factors, providing a foundation, imperfect but vital, for the eventual development of germ theory, epidemiology, and public health, while popular remedies and household knowledge, herbs, vinegar, isolation, cautious handling of objects and trade goods, though largely ineffective against Yersinia pestis itself, demonstrate the early integration of precautionary principles into daily life, a remarkable adaptation by ordinary people responding to crisis. Social structures shifted in response to both mortality and labor scarcity. The sudden decline in population forced landlords to negotiate with tenants, wages rose, and serfs who had previously been bound more tightly to the land gained leverage, while guilds, monasteries, and civic organizations innovated systems of mutual aid, burial, and care for the ill, providing models for more resilient communities, and thus, paradoxically, the plague destabilized but also strengthened social cohesion in ways that influenced the trajectory of European society for generations, laying groundwork for changes in labor, urban organization, and governance. Even culinary culture reflected adaptation and resilience. Scarcity inspired creativity, with soups, stews, breads, and preserves made from available ingredients, often with herbs thought to prevent disease, and communal feasts following lull periods in outbreaks became intense celebrations of survival, demonstrating the human desire to affirm life in the presence of death, while music and storytelling, often macabre, often cautionary, provided a means of communal processing of grief and fear, reinforcing bonds and creating a living memory of shared experience. Spiritual life was transformed. The relentless visibility of death led to both fervent piety and radical questioning, inspiring new devotional practices, the rise of confraternities, and local rituals designed to intercede for the living and the dead, blending fear, hope, and compassion, while in some cases eroding blind trust in authority and fostering the seeds of more personal spiritual reflection. And as these centuries unfolded, the shadow of the plague became a lens through which societies interpreted vulnerability, ethics, and the human condition. It influenced laws regarding trade, burial, and movement, inspired literature and visual arts, reshaped economies and social hierarchies, and instilled a cautious pragmatism into everyday life, the echo of which can still be traced in modern customs, from hygiene practices to public health measures to memorial traditions, and even in the pervasive awareness of mortality that colors cultural rituals, festivals, and the arts. Walking through modern European cities, one can still detect the imprint. Cemeteries on city outskirts, church murals depicting death, folklore that warns and teaches, local customs surrounding disease and hygiene, the collective memory encoded in architecture and street layouts, even the caution and care observed in marketplaces. These are all remnants of a lived history in which the plague was both destroyer and teacher. In homes, the continuation of practices like washing hands, careful handling of food, and attention to ventilation can trace their roots back to these centuries of experience with pestilence, while stories, songs, and visual art passed down through generations preserve a sense of human vulnerability and endurance, ensuring that the lessons of the past remain active in cultural consciousness, and reminding us that catastrophe, while destructive, also engenders adaptation, creativity, and moral reflection. The Black Death, though unimaginable in its immediacy, left humanity with a deeper awareness of mortality and the interconnectedness of life, a recognition that social bonds, hygiene, observation, and cultural expression are vital to collective survival, and that memory itself, whether encoded in text, song, ritual, or art, serves as a shield and guide, linking the experience of the past with the challenges of the present. And so, as we reflect on the long shadow of the plague from the quiet vantage of the modern world, we can perceive its echoes in every ritual, every story, every caution, and every celebration that acknowledges the fragility and preciousness of life. For the legacy of that catastrophe is not only measured in the lives it took, but also in the resilience, creativity, and humanity it nurtured. And as night falls once more over towns and fields, one can almost hear the faint toll of distant bells. Smell the smoke of ancient fires, taste the herbs and bread that sustain families, and feel, lingering in the air, a quiet lesson that survival, memory, and reflection are the threads that link past and present, and that even in the face of relentless shadow, life endures, carries forward, and shapes the world yet to come. Long after the last bells tolled over the empty streets, and the furrows of freshly turned soil bore witness to both loss and survival, the world shaped by the plague continued to carry the imprint of those centuries-long shadows, and though bodies decayed, names were forgotten, and towns rebuilt over mass graves, the memory of that devastation lingered not only in chronicles, manuscripts, and art but in the very rhythms of daily life, in the habits, rituals, and stories that people passed from parent to child, forming a living archive of experience that shaped human thought, society, and imagination for generations. And as the centuries unfolded, these echoes became woven into the consciousness of communities, informing not only practical decisions but also philosophy, culture, and the way people understood vulnerability and resilience. In the quiet villages that had once emptied under the weight of death, local traditions persisted, often subtly altered yet recognizably descended from the age of pestilence. Festivals marking the cycles of harvest were infused with prayers for protection and remembrance. Songs carried the somber tones of loss alongside the joy of survival, and rituals surrounding birth, marriage, and death incorporated precautions, symbolic gestures, and prayers learned in the crucible of repeated waves of disease, creating a cultural landscape in which fear and hope, grief and joy, were permanently intertwined, and these practices, though centuries old, informed a sense of continuity and human perseverance that extended beyond immediate survival. In the cities, the lessons were both practical and symbolic. As public health measures gradually became codified, cemeteries were regulated and expanded, waste management slowly improved, and authorities recorded patterns of illness with greater attention, laying the foundations for epidemiology, urban planning, and medical science, while architecture also reflected the memory of catastrophe, from hospital wards designed to isolate the sick to chapels adorned with reminders of mortality, and even street layouts and marketplaces evolved to mitigate congestion and promote hygiene, demonstrating that human experience and memory can shape the physical world as much as it shapes culture and consciousness. At the same time, the plague's legacy manifested in profound social transformation, for the scarcity of labor-empowered survivors, reshaping feudal hierarchies, challenging rigid social orders, and creating new opportunities for mobility and negotiation that echoed through the centuries, while guilds, religious confraternities, and local organizations strengthened bonds of mutual aid, responding to vulnerability with cooperation and care, and thus, the catastrophe that had caused such immense suffering also engendered resilience, adaptation, and innovation, creating a paradoxical legacy in which destruction and growth were inseparably entwined. The arts and literature continued to preserve the shadow of the plague, as writers, painters, and musicians translated collective grief and reflection into enduring cultural forms, from the stark imagery of skeletons leading the living in the danse macabre, to chronicles recording both tragedy and acts of courage, to poetry reflecting on mortality and human frailty. These creative expressions became vessels for memory and instruction, showing that even in the most horrifying of circumstances, human imagination and aesthetic sense persisted, offering both warning and solace, moral guidance and emotional catharsis, and teaching that reflection on mortality could coexist with the pursuit of beauty and meaning. Science, too, emerged from the long experience of pestilence, as careful observation, documentation of symptoms, and attempts at treatment laid the groundwork for later developments in medicine, from germ theory to public health, and while early remedies were often ineffective, the process of systematic inquiry and empirical recording of outcomes demonstrated an enduring human commitment to understanding and responding to natural forces, a commitment that eventually led to the ability to predict, prevent, and treat outbreaks with precision unimaginable to the physicians of the medieval and early modern periods. Beyond practical measures, the psychological and moral imprint of the plague shaped human thought, cultivating a deep awareness of mortality, the fragility of social bonds, and the value of community, For those who survived learned to navigate fear, uncertainty, and grief with courage, care, and resourcefulness, and in doing so, they transmitted these lessons to subsequent generations, ensuring that human memory, ethical reasoning, and cultural practice were informed by both suffering and survival, creating a continuous dialogue between past and present that enriched social, spiritual, and intellectual life. This awareness of mortality also inspired philosophical reflection and artistic expression, as thinkers grappled with the transience of life, the inevitability of death, and the responsibilities of the living, producing works that combined practical counsel, moral instruction, and aesthetic contemplation, and in turn influencing education, governance, and civic culture, so that the lessons of the plague extended far beyond immediate experience into the enduring structures of European society, shaping values, priorities, and cultural consciousness. At the level of individual and family, the legacy of the plague remained intimate and tangible, from habits of hygiene, observation of symptoms, and cautious interaction, to stories told at the hearth about vanished neighbors, heroic acts, and uncanny survival, to the remembrance of ancestors in rituals, prayers, and communal events, all of which preserved memory and informed identity, creating a continuity of human experience rooted in resilience, reflection, and moral engagement, while simultaneously acknowledging vulnerability and the randomness of fate. Trade, commerce, and urban life also bore the imprint of centuries of pestilence, as merchants learned caution, cities regulated goods and movement, and legal frameworks evolved to address liability, contagion, and mortality, embedding the lessons of plague into the very machinery of society. And even as global trade expanded, these historical memories informed practice, governance, and risk management, creating a bridge between past catastrophes and modern systems of health, regulation, and commerce. Spirituality and ritual, deeply affected by the repeated exposure to death, reflected both fear and hope. Devotional practices, confraternities, and pilgrimages persisted, often incorporating preventive measures, prayers for the living and the dead, and symbolic acts drawn from centuries of experience, while the arts of lamentation, memorialization, and celebration intertwined, forming a cultural fabric in which mortality was acknowledged and embraced as part of human life, fostering compassion, ethical reflection, and communal solidarity. Today, the echoes of that long shadow are present in architecture, urban planning, cultural rituals, storytelling, medicine, and collective consciousness. Cemeteries at city outskirts, murals depicting mortality, literature reflecting on fragility, public health measures informed by centuries of observation, even common hygiene practices, all carry the trace of human experience shaped by recurrent plague, and in recognizing these echoes, we gain insight into the continuity of human adaptation. Memory resonates in our own era, showing that humanity's long relationship with infectious disease is both ancient and instructive, and that each generation inherits strategies, knowledge, and cultural practices forged in response to prior challenges, providing a blueprint for both caution and hope. Memory, creativity, and adaptation became inseparable from the experience of survival, shaping rituals, festivals, literature, art, medicine, governance, and moral imagination. And as we consider the lives of those who endured, from peasants tending flocks on abandoned hillsides to physicians documenting symptoms, from mothers guarding children to artisans painting grim reminders of mortality, we see the intricate web of human response to catastrophe, a tapestry in which fear, courage, grief, hope, and ingenuity are interwoven, and we recognize that the past lives on not only in documents and monuments, but in the habits, practices, and values we continue to observe today. In reflecting on the long shadow of the plague, we perceive that it was not simply a disease but a profound teacher, a force that forced humanity to confront mortality, re-evaluate priorities, strengthen social bonds, innovate in medicine and public health, create art and literature that endured, and ultimately develop resilience and moral imagination, a dual legacy of fragility and strength that continues to inform the human condition, culture, and society. And so as we close this final chapter, we are left with the quiet resonance of centuries, the subtle but persistent echo of lives lived in terror, endurance, and reflection, the wisdom and rituals passed down from ancestors who walked streets emptied by disease, who tilled fields abandoned by the dead, who sang, prayed, wept, and hoped, leaving a heritage that permeates the modern world, a living testament to the intertwined nature of suffering and creativity, mortality and perseverance. And as we walk through contemporary streets, read stories, practice rituals, and navigate social life, we remain connected to that history, feeling, in the faintest way, the presence of those who endured the plague, and understanding that the past, though distant, lives within us, shaping awareness, compassion, and the quiet courage to continue in the face of uncertainty. And in that recognition, the story of the plague becomes not only a chronicle of death, but a meditation on life, memory, culture, and the enduring spirit of humanity, a legacy carried forward in every careful observation, every act of remembrance, and every gesture of survival, ensuring that the shadow, though long and terrible, illuminates as much as it darkens, teaching humanity how to endure, adapt, and remember, and leaving us with a profound understanding that even in the deepest darkness, life continues, carrying the wisdom of centuries into the present and the future.